All right, well, Robert S. Allen, Geological Correlation and Paleoecology, Bulletin of the Geological Society of America. This guy, this author of these videos and notes, really did his homework. And it's across the board, not just one particular source. And over a number of years, so we have nearly irrefutable evidence of the fact that the worldwide flood is accountable for the reason why the earth looks the way it does today, in every little detail. Another biblical implication of the flood account is that great numbers of living creatures must have been entrapped and buried in the swirling sediments. Under ordinary processes of nature as now occurring, fossils, especially of landmass animals and even marine vertebrates, are very rarely formed. The only way they can be preserved long enough from the usual processes of decay, scavenging, and disintegration, which takes many years, is by means of quick burial in aqueous sediments. William J. Miller, Emeritus Professor of Geology at U.C.L.A., points this out. He says, comparatively few remains of organisms now inhabiting the earth are being deposited under conditions favorable for their preservation as fossils. It is nevertheless remarkable that so vast a number of fossils are embedded in the rocks, unless something happened in a catastrophic manner. Not uniformitarianism. William J. Miller, Introduction to Historical Geology. That the rock formations of the earth are veritably rich in fossils is a hard fact to reconcile with the paucity of potential fossils being formed under present conditions. Geologists sometimes speak of the incompleteness of the fossil record, but this is only because of the absence of the anticipated missing links in the supposed evolutionary sequence of development. There is an abundance of fossils known of all kinds of creatures. Naturally, practically all modern families and most genera are represented in the fossil record, as well as great numbers of extinct creatures. An outstanding Swedish scientist, late director of the Botanical Institute at Lund, Sweden, says, it has been argued that the series of paleontological finds is too intermittent, too full of missing links to serve. It's full of missing links. It's kind of ironic. There's not enough connection from one species to the next, so to serve as a convincing proof. If a postulated ancestral type is not found, it is simply stated that it has not so far been found. So they say, well, it'll be found, so it's for sure there. Well, you've never found it. Decades, centuries go by. Darwin himself often used this argument, and in his time it was perhaps justifiable. But it has lost its value through the immense advances of paleobiology in the 20th century. The true situation is that those fossils have not been found, which were expected to be found. Just where new branches are supposed to fork off from the main stem, it has been impossible to find the connecting types. I was just reminded of Cro-Magnon man. Wow, what an advanced prehistoric man. He has all the capabilities and then some of modern-day man, except the fashionable dress. Well, the problem with that is, now they've decided from their own research that it was just an offshoot. So that particular branch of humanity went off into a tangent and then flat out disappeared. They had to make up these stories. So they go back to the other human species, pre-humans. And Heribert Nilsson, Synthetische Art Building. Okay, German. The late Dr. Richard Goldschmidt of the University of California, one of the world's outstanding geneticists, said in a similar vein, in spite of the immense amount of the paleontological material and the existence of long series of intact stratigraphic sequences with perfect records for the lower categories, transitions between the higher categories are missing. All right, just some spell corrections. In spite of the immense amount of the paleontologic material and the existence of long series of intact stratigraphic sequences with perfect records for the lower categories, transitions between the higher categories are missing. Richard Goldsmith, Evolution as Viewed by One Geneticist. These guys were published, well published, and this author of this video has done a marvelous job. He says, the point to be made here is that the fossil deposits are very rich, both in numbers and variety, in spite of having yielded up very few, if any, forms that might be considered as transitional between distinct kinds of creatures. So we don't have anything that says, well, this evolved into that. Similarity, but not evolutionary, whether living or extinct. The richness of the deposits fits well with the Genesis record of the character and magnitude of the Great Flood, but accords very poorly with the uniformitarian notion that the relatively quiescent sedimentary processes of the present day, forming almost no fossils, can account for the extensive fossil-bearing strata of millions of years ago, hundreds of millions of years ago. It seems evident, therefore, that the major geological inferences that can be derived from the biblical record of the flood are in good agreement with the actual geological facts as seen in the field. But this does not mean, of course, that these facts have been thus interpreted. They have rather been fitted as well as possible into the uniformitarian scheme of historical geology. In fact, the sedimentary strata with their entombed fossils have been made the very basis of the system of interpretation. These rocks have been divided into chronologic sequences based on the types of fossils contained in them, the resulting false synthesis being the generally accepted geological ages, with the fossil sequences supposedly demonstrating the evolutionary history of life on the Earth. They spent many times, but then the problem, the many opportunities there to make their point on their particular invented synthesis. However, the problem is there's so many exceptions around the world, so a lot of times they'll just go ahead and deny the plausibility or ignore or make up some kind of a makeshift story how it breaks the rules. We've seen that before elsewhere. Let's begin, Dr. Don Patton. Let's begin by looking at the geologic column. Probably the most effective and persuasive argument made by evolutionists today. We've told that this is what you find when you dig down in the earth, beginning with a quaternary up near the top. You find the modern animals, man and mammals. As you come further down to the Cretaceous, you find the dinosaurs. At the Triassic and the Permian, you've got the reptiles, and Pennsylvanian, the amphibians, and finally down to the bottom to the Cambrian, which below that there's no life forms, which according to the evolutionary prediction should contain most of the single-cell organisms, when in fact, what do you find? You find virtually every animal phylum there, including the vertebrates. This, admittedly, a lot of them are smaller. Worldwide flood, what gets buried first? The spherical and the dense. That's usually the smaller ones. The biggest problem with this kind of representation is that you can't dig down into the earth and find it anywhere. You find it in the textbooks, but you don't find it in its complete form anywhere. Notice a statement by Leet and Judson in their book Physical Geology, a textbook I was taught from at 2 different state universities. Because we cannot find sedimentary rocks representing all of the earth time neatly in one convenient area, we must piece together the rock sequence from locality to locality. He affirms it's not in one place. It is a construct pieced together. Compare a quotation from Dr. Patton's notes. His wonderful notes that he gave me alongside his videotape. If a pile were to be made by using the greatest thickness of sedimentary beds of each geological age, it would be at least 100 miles high. It is, of course, impossible to have even a considerable fraction of this great pile available at any one place. The Grand Canyon of the Colorado, for example, is only 1 mile deep, not 100 miles. Von Engelen and Castor in Geology. The process of tying one rock sequence in one place to another in some other place is known as correlation, from the Latin for together plus relate, correlation. I. Don Leet, Harvard, and Sheldon Judson, Princeton, Physical Geology. Now, the process of correlation, when it's based on rock formations in a local area, works fairly well, but when that's ignored and is based on fossils ignoring the rock formation, then we have some serious problem. Actually, more than one, problems. Notice the statement by Derek Ager, who is telling us how this correlation process works. He says, fossils have been and still are the best and most accurate method of dating and correlating the rocks in which they occur. When you're building this complete column from worldwide sampling of fossils, it's done as a result of looking at the fossils and ignoring the rock units. Many people think it's done by the radiometric dating systems, telling which is older and which is younger. He tells us very clearly that's not the case. Continuing, he says, well, I can think of no cases of radioactive decay being used to date fossils. I remember a case myself where they dated a rock on the border of some body of water that appeared to have been there for a long time. Who knows? Come and go. And one side of the rock was not that big of a rock, maybe a couple of feet. One end of the rock, the radiometric dating, U-235 dating system, had it like 20,000 years older than the one on the other side of the rock. How can the same rock have two different ages that far apart? It's utter nonsense. Besides that, when you do U-235, for example, uranium is soluble. So you measure the uranium versus the lead. Well, if it was right near an edge of a body of water, maybe some of the water was over that rock for millions of years. So the uranium might have leached out. So it's just utter nonsense. It's not scientific. They're using scientific principles to project something that's not scientific. Derek Ager. He's the past president of British Geological Association. Anyway, compare a quotation from Dr. Patton's notes. A rock that had an early form of an organism was clearly older than rocks containing later forms. Furthermore, all rocks that had the early form, no matter how far apart those rocks were, geographically, would have to be at the same age. Fossil successions made it possible today that the Cambrian rocks are older than the Ordovician rocks. In this way, our geologic timetable came into being. Without the theory of evolution and the interdisciplinary science of paleontology, it could not exist. Putnam and Bassett Geology. This guy's done his homework. All you have to do is go to the library and look this up. So the dating of the fossils is done rather on the basis of the fossils themselves. Well, how do the fossils tell us whether or not they ought to be on top or bottom? Well, that comes from the assumption of evolution, that you must begin with the assumption in order to build this complete column. I think we can see an obvious problem with the logic in this process, as acknowledged by R.H. Rostel of Cambridge University in the Encyclopedia Britannica. He says, it cannot be denied that from a strictly philosophical or logical standpoint, geologists are here arguing in a circle. The succession of organisms